right, getting into our final chapter, finally, of the skeletal system, we're going to talk about joints. This one's not as crazy as the ones we just went over in the last couple chapters, but it's still going to be a lot. So just bear with us as we get through this last one for Unit 1. So what are we going to get into with this chapter? We're going to talk about some of the functional and structural classifications of body joints. We're also going to talk about characteristics found in different categories of joints like fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints. Talk about some examples, talk about body movements, and then also get into some specific body joints and the movements that are allowed by each, and then a little tiny bit of development of body joints. So let's get into the classification of joints first. We're going to first talk about the two ways we can classify them based on functionality and structure. We'll talk about the functional types of joints, give some examples. Then we'll list the three types of diol joints as well. So what is a joint? First of all, before we even classify it, what is a joint, or an articulation as it might be better known as? This is just where bones are coming together with bones, or bones are coming together with cartilage, and we're forming some form of connection, right? They're articulating together. So you may have heard me use that word of they're articulating together, or there's an articulation. All we're saying is that bones are meeting other bones or cartilage at a point, and they can move or maybe not, right? That just depends on how we're classifying them. So if we are classifying joints based on the functionality, then we're talking about how much movement does that joint allow for. But if we're talking about what material connects the bones, that's going to be a structural classification. So two different ways that we can classify the joints. How much movement do they give us, or what material are we using to connect those bones together? So if we're looking at the functional classes, so this is where we're looking at how much mobility do we have between the bones that are coming together, we have three classifications: synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis. So synarthrosis means that it is nearly immobile, or it's immobile completely. These cannot move. These bones come together and that is it. They are not moving around. Amphiarthrosis, this is where we have some mobility, some movement with these bones, but not a whole lot. And then diarthrosis, this is a completely freely movable joint. So usually if you're thinking of a joint, you're probably thinking of a diarthrosis classified joint, because you're thinking of maybe like your elbow or your knee or your shoulder, something that you have a lot of movement in. Something like the synarthrosis joints you probably are not thinking of would be like the sutures that stitch our cranial bones together, where you really don't want those ones to move. So like I just mentioned, the bones forming the cranium are going to be a perfect example, right, of bones that are kept together with synarthrosis classified joints, namely the sutures, right? We don't want these joints to move. We want them to be held stitched into place, right? In this case, we're looking at the coronal, squamous, and lambdoid sutures, which should sound familiar since we covered them in a previous chapter. An amphiarthrosis joint would be like the vertebra. So the vertebra and the intervertebral disc between them, they do have some movement, but it's not a lot. The only reason why your back moves as much as it does is because the summation of all the vertebra moving, but each individual joint between two vertebrae, there's not a lot of movement in between those two vertebrae. You have to look at all of them moving together when you twist or bend or flex, right, so that you can move your back. It's all of those joints working together that gives you the bigger movement, but the individual joints between the vertebrae don't have a whole lot of movement, so we call them amphiarthrosis for that reason. And then diarthrosis classified joints, this is what you're probably thinking when you think of a joint. We're thinking multi-axial joints. So in this case, we're looking at the hip, which is a ball and socket joint, where we have the head of the femur coming in the acetabulum of the hip bone, so that we have this, we can rotate, we can move up, back, around, all sorts of different directions. There's a lot of movement with the diarthrosis classified joint. We can also name them based on what structures or what materials we find in these joints. We have the fibrous joint. These are going to be bones that are joined together by a fibrous connective tissue. There are cartilaginous joints, which are joined by hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. And then the synovial joint, where the bones are not actually directly connected. Instead, there's going to be a joint cavity filled with a lubricating fluid that's going to kind of create a buffer zone between those bones. And this is, again, probably what you're thinking of when you think of a joint, because a lot of our freely movable joints, a lot of the diarthrotic joints, are synovial joints.